There's already the first question. Is Rasta in the house?
Looks like it.
Yes, it is. Perfect. Welcome to this Firstbeat Sports webinar with our guest speaker, Dominic Theodorou from Rasta Vehta. Just a second, so I will share my screen, and there we go. So today's title is Beyond the Basics, 5 Secret Use Cases for Load Monitoring in Elite Sports. Very shortly about myself. I'm Joel Wenning, exercise physiologist and working as a customer success manager here at Firstbeat, making sure with my team that our customers are not just collecting data, but taking most out of it. Shortly about Firstbeat as well, we are the pioneers in physiology-based sports technology, and we have a very strong scientific background with over 300 scientific publications done with Firstbeat Sports. Shortly about our system, how it's working. In the core, we have the Firstbeat Spot sensor, which is collecting heart rate variability, and acceleration data. It has an internal memory, meaning that when the athlete puts the sensor on, it starts automatically recording. The data is stored in the sensor automatically, and once the athlete takes the sensor off, it stops recording automatically. Then we have the coach or athlete app for real-time monitoring, and also there the data download process is automatic. So recording is automatic, data download is automatic, and on the right side we have the reporting and data management, which is also automatic. So once the data is downloaded, athletes will get training reports and the coaching staff will get then a summary report. And for example, weekly reports are also automatic. So once a week, for example, there's a comprehensive summary of the last week and the last 12 weeks. Yes, so that was a very short introduction. Firstbeat Sports, we will shortly give Tom the stage, but before that, a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar is planned to last about 1 hour. There's a Q&A box where you can type in your questions, and hopefully we have time to answer them at the end of this webinar. If not, we will answer them later via email, and if you need to leave at some point, we will send you the recording automatically, so don't worry about that. First, we have a question for you before we get officially started, so I will activate a poll here. Just a second. You can already, Tom, take the stage and share your screen.
Okay, I'll do that.
So now you should be seeing the first question, which is, what is the most interesting topic for you today? And there we have 5 choices: training load during national team breaks, decide when a player needs a top-up session, compare and manage off-season versus in-season loads, monitor return to play progress after sickness, and track private and individual workouts alongside team sessions. So just 30 seconds more so everyone has time to answer the question. So we will see that what is the most interesting topic today and on which we will then probably spend some more time.
Oh, interesting.
Okay, I think almost everybody has answered. So I will end the poll and share the results with you. So training load during national team breaks, 9% of you is the most interesting topic, then 26 for both decide when a player needs a top-up session, compare and manage off-season loads, also 26%, 9% monitor return to play progress after sickness, and then 29%. So that was the most interesting one, track private and individual workouts alongside team sessions. So those 3 we will spend then more time on in this webinar, and of course then later on we can also discuss those with you if you would like so. But yes, very happy to have you here, Tom, and share your insights from Rasta Vehta. Please, the stage is yours.
All right, let me go back here now. Perfect. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Once again, thank you, Joel. Thank you, Firstbeat. And usually, whenever I give a presentation, it's not that I always that I do that on a constant basis, but I like to always start with this quote because I think that sums up everything that we do in professional sports. Because in my understanding, the environment in professional sport is very complex, and I would always like to come up with easy solutions. And that's why I like this quote. About me, I'm going into my 4th year with Rasta Fechter, working as a performance coach. My previous clubs have been in BG Göttingen and Borussia Bamberg. The topics we will we will touch on today, I mean, everybody knows it already. I'm not going to repeat it, but I will say that we also have 2 surprises, something that we haven't really set up front, but we're going to get to that. In general, what I want to say, everything that I'm about to present here today has basically emerged throughout my time of using the Firstbeat system, in a very intense way. Let's call it like this. And I started using it in 2021. And the topics, or basically the topic of the day, is what are, let's say, the little secrets behind load monitoring. In the beginning of me using Firstbeat, I was all about figuring out what my key parameters are. Of course, I wanted to understand them first, and then I was all about monitoring practices because we never used the system during games, which we still not do. I think you might ask me something for that too, Joel, but we're still not using it in games yet. And like all the topics that we talk about today, I basically stumbled on them. They, like I said before, they emerged throughout the process of me using the Firstbeat system. And a lot of stuff that I do includes a lot of trial and error as well. Also, I mean, I think I can say that, Joel, we have pretty much extensive history in our WhatsApp chat because I speak to Joel a lot and he's a great help. So just simply great customer service. And we also talk about the contents, of course, because it helps probably also both of us, not just me, of course. But I'm very happy that I can always rely on you if I have a question. And I would also like to say there is no magic formula, and I don't have the magic formula. Yeah, it's just like I said before, it's a lot of trial and error. And in professional sports, that's what I also have learned throughout the years. Nothing will ever be perfect. Then let's speak about the first topic: national team windows and summer training camps. So in our context, in European professional basketball, what happens twice a day is the FIBA Euro, like the FIBA breaks, the FIBA windows. They happen. So that's when we have national team players in our team, when they are selected, they go to their national teams, and that sometimes can involve long travels, jet lag, unfamiliar practice routines, and different playing conditions, having a different head coach and stuff like that. And this year, for example, we had one player, he was with the Canadian national team. That's why he had to travel a lot. And these windows then last for, it depends, 5 to 7 to 8 days. And what I figured out only this year, I was like, okay, what about we can equip the player or just like give him the heart rate sensor and the heart rate strap for that time frame to at least being able to track the training data throughout the practices. Of course, we had to ask, or I always asked the federation up front if they would allow that. And they did. So then for me, it was, of course, much better to get the training load from that particular player instead of only relying on the RPE, because I think having the training load makes it gives us just a better picture, and also it allows us to continually monitoring the training with me or with our performance staff not even being present. And the same holds true for summer training camps. Let's say you have a player, in our case, signed for next year. And these days, what happens a lot, the agencies of the players, they sometimes come up with summer training camps. And if I can give the player then the heart rate strap, I at least see much better what he is doing and how he's coping with the demands, of course. in the case of that you have an import player that you maybe already signed during the season for next year, you could give him also, because in the summer they mostly return home and be in the States like for 2 months or something. You can also equip that player then with the system to track their summer training while they're in the US. This is a great idea, but I haven't had the chance to do that yet. But if I have, I would definitely do so. And then there's already the what I was talking about in the beginning, the case that we didn't really point out. I would like to talk to you a little bit about 3x3, because what happened like a month ago, we had one player of our team. He joined the national DBB team in 3x3. And then I was like, why not? Why not giving him a sensor and a heart rate strap? And he even came up with that before I even could ask him, because it was like, hey, Dom, can't I use it? And that's what we did. And in order to give you some context, it's important to say that our season was over, and then there was like a break of a week. He didn't do much for 4 days, then started like with a little individual practice again for 2-3 days. And then there was the first session, the first 3x3 practice, basically. And he gave me a text after that practice. So he sent me a text, and he was like, hey, Dom, can you please check the data online? I mean, if I had to rate practice, I would probably give you a 12 out of 10. And in order to give you a little bit context about that, he would be a player who would always rate practice with a 7 or 8. Even if it was really hard, then he would sometimes give a 9, but most of the time 7, 8. To give you a little bit more context, even, if you look at this table, I hope you can see my cursor. So you have here game day -4, game day -3, game day -2, game day -1, and you have peak values. Let's stay here on the game day -4 as an example. So this is the average practice load for this particular player who joined the DBB 3x3 team for the whole season for trimp and movement load. So on a game day -4, he averaged 78 trimp, movement load of 142. On game day -3, you can see it was a little higher. Game day -3 usually would be our development day. And you can see this for the other days too. And now let's check peak values. These peak values, epoch peak 115 was the max epoch peak during the whole season. So the peak value for this particular player. Yeah. Same with the high intensity training. So he spent the most amount of minutes he spent above 90% of his heart rate max during the whole season for all the team practices was 14 minutes. Just to give you a little reference. And then I saw the training report from his first 3x3 session. And that basically looked like this. So if you see here on the bottom, the session lasted 1 hour and 46 minutes. Our training sessions typically last, well, let's say last season typically last between 60 and 90 minutes, not much more than that. But what you can see here, he had a trimp of 228, a movement load of 259. His epoch peak, I'm not sure if that's the highest epoch peak I've ever seen, at least from my lens for a practice. I think it is 222. And he spent 37 minutes above 90% of his heart rate max. And my first reaction was, hey, Dom, that must be a mistake. There must be a measure. This must be a measurement error. And that's what I checked. And the data seemed fine. And I still remember I reached out to you, Joel, and you also confirmed that. And this is what I would like call this a concern, because this is way, way more than what he is usually used to. And
it's almost more than double.
Exactly. And what also happened, what I saw then, he had a new max heart rate. And then I was like, because that's what I said, nothing will ever be perfect, because that basically means that the previous 2 years I recorded the data, I didn't have the, let's say, correct max heart rate. And the reason why I'm telling you this, it's good to know RPE. Yeah. Very good to know RPE. But if you know this, then you get a much better representation of what that particular player truly went through in this practice session. And what happened afterwards, he actually wanted to continue to work on the next day. And I told him, hey, you know what? Luckily, there was no 3x3 practice on the next day, so I could tell him, hey, lay low a little bit. The takeaways.
Can I just comment on that?
Yeah.
So
go ahead, please.
Yeah. Yes. So your hardest training days averages have been on game day -4 and game day -3, roughly 100 trim, a bit lower, and 150 movement load. And as I said, those are quite far away from the actual numbers that the player was reaching in this session. But which is interesting for you is that he probably will join the national team in the future as well. So you can prepare the athlete better for the national team camps because you also want him to succeed there, not only on the club level.
Yeah, very true. And to add what you just said, he is a guy who typically accumulates movement load at a much lower pace than other guys. So that's why his movement load values are also not as high. Usually on game day -3s, we would see 250, like 220, between 220 and 260, something like that. And my two takeaways from this situation is, or from this encounter, is basically that it's very important to have realistic max heart rates in your Firstbeat setup. I think you cannot truly rely on the automatic, how do you say this, on the automatic way of how Firstbeat comes up with the max heart rate. And I think you also always have to check the peak heart rates. That's what I do every 1 or 2. I mean, in the preseason, I do it after each week. I check all the peak heart rates because, I want to have the most realistic one put in the system, of course. And like I said, nothing will ever be perfect. The reason why I'm telling you this, I had once a case. We had a player joining our team, and he came from a different, from another team who also used Firstbeat before. And before the season even started, he would tell me that in his previous club, they would always say that he doesn't work hard enough because he never spends time in the regions of 90% above the max heart rate. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. So let's see, give me 1 or 2 weeks. I'm going to check the peak heart rates from you during the first 2 weeks of preseason, and then we see maybe we have to edit it. So what I saw, I think, is if you relied on like the standard form, his peak heart rate was put at 196 or something. But the highest, what I would see, was 176. And the practices we had at that times, they were pretty demanding. So I had to reduce it. And then, of course, obviously, he would also spend time in higher heart rate zones. So that's, for me, it was like a little light bulb moment, because then I recognized, okay, how it's actually very important to check that.
Yeah. You are referring to the automatic calculation in a way that when you type in the birth date of the athlete, it automatically calculates the max heart rate based on the age. And it's just a rough calculation, what could be the max heart rate of that athlete. But what we are always suggesting now customers to do is rather to set the heart rate too low than too high, because our system automatically updates the max heart rate if a new max heart rate is reached, and in that way you will get the actual real max heart rate from that athlete.
Yeah, and there's going to be an outlier every now and then. That's why it's also really important to check it yourself.
Yeah. You mean an outlier based on
that is very low, that in general doesn't go up high.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, then let's move on. How to decide when a player needs a top-up training session. I consider it one of my most important things, I think, is to keep the low-minute players ready, because most of the time they just basically they stand a little bit more on the side doing practice compared to the guys who are the players with heavy minutes. That's what I just said. And then at some point I was asking myself, okay, how can I manage this? Of course, you get an idea. It's a little bit like you get a little sense for it if players stay longer outside of the court, doing practice. But sometimes you basically don't know, because sometimes you're preoccupied with other things. In my position, sometimes you have an injured guy where I have to, focus on. But then I was like, okay, how can I handle this better? So what I did, basically, you have to ask myself the question. First of all, how do I know if a player practices less? And if I know, what do I do about it? And how do I decide how much top-up training that player still needs? So these are basically the two questions. And what I figured, like I said, the way how I interpret things, I decided, okay, let's work with the movement load on that. Give you an example. So let's say, I know this is a little cheap, but I think it gets the job done. So here we have the average values of the team. So on top here is the average, like how much time they spend above 90%. Here you have the trim on average. Here you have the movement load on average. And on the bottom, you have the epoch. So if you now check this player, yeah, he only has a movement load of 111 compared to 183. A trim of 43, epoch of 21, and hasn't spent any seconds yet above 90%. So first of all, I love this because you can see right away, okay, who moves a little more. And if most of the time, 95% of the cases, it's the lower minute guys who don't get as much practice exposure. They obviously have less trim. Less trim also, but less movement load. So let's look at this. This is an overview of the practice session. So on the bottom, this is the player I just talked about. Yeah. On top, these are the average values. Yeah. So if I now go one step further, because that's also how I handle things during live monitoring, this is the exact same practice, but without the player we are talking about. So if I monitor live, in order to decide, okay, if it's too much or too little what we're doing, I always take these outliers, these guys who are very much below, I always take them out because this gives me a better representation of the overall training load. So in the end, the practice finished like this. Yeah. So we had an average trim of 93, average movement load of 190, and the player had these like these figures on the bottom, 43 and 111. So to me, there's a gap in movement load of 80. So what I do now, first of all, you have to take into consideration how these players accumulate movement load. In my experience, the point guard always, they accumulate the movement load at the most, like the fastest rate. Some guys do it at a lesser rate. What I always say, I take the gap and always add, let's say, movement out of 20 or something. So for this particular day, I would want, it's either me or one of our assistant coaches, ask them to take this guy post-practice through an individual workout that, lasts around a movement load of 100. So this is a very easy way of going about this. And is that a perfect solution? Probably not. Yeah, it's not perfect. But I do think it is practical. It's very easy to check. And then, like, going back to the quotation that I showed you at the first slide, perfectly fits into that category. Then let's say this particular player we just have talked about can also play in a second team that practices on the same day at night. So then what we would talk about, maybe we don't do a top-up training session with him, and maybe we let him practice in the evening with the other team. Probably not a full practice. That would always go back to how much training he accumulates during the first practice of the day. But this then is always a little bit like fine-tuning, making a decision, talking to the coach of the second team, talking to our coach, talking to the player, of course. But this is, in a nutshell, how I go about this.
Yeah. Now you are, Dom, only looking at topping up the external load, so the movement load, and not looking at the internal load. But if I remember correctly, you had a good explanation for that why you are concentrating on movement load in this case.
Yeah. So the reason why I don't really check trim is the fact that from years of using Firstbeat, I know that during an individual workout, the density aspect of practice is very high. Yeah, because the player doesn't have to, there's simply no breaks if it's only him who's practicing. So that means he will accumulate trimp at a much faster rate. And I know our assistant coaches, it's not that they just let him spot shoot or something. They really let him go through a workout. And that's why I'm not really concerned with that. My overall concern is that, that the player who gets less mechanical exposure keeps
Mm-hmm.
up with the team, basically. And the
Yep.
trim, that's a byproduct. He will accumulate that anyway.
Yeah. So you are saying that he will anyway accumulate enough trim during that individual workout.
For sure. That's what I have found out in the last years. And I know my assistant coaches, I know
Yeah.
that they are not, yeah. So that's pretty demanding, actually. I think the overall outputs, like from a mechanical point of view, will be probably less because it's
Mm-hmm.
always different if you have to beat a player off the dribble instead of if you're doing something on your own. Yeah.
Yep.
But still, the internal demands are quite high then.
Yep. Yep.
Training load after sickness. Very interesting topic. Also, of course, anecdotal experience, I'd say. This is probably common sense, yeah, that internal training load tends to be elevated when returning to practice after an illness. I think this is what most of us would sign for. What I'm going to show you now is an example of a player who missed 11 days straight because he was sick. And he was really sick. He was running a temperature, high fever, was really had to be in bed for the whole day in the initial days. So the first example I'm showing you now, the average training load for 8 practices within a time span of 11 days before he got sick. And in these practices, he averaged a trimp of 111, a movement load of 208. Movement efficiency is, for me, movement load divided by trimp, 2.15. And he showed on average epoch peak values for 46, and his heart rate recovery was 53. So now what I'll show you is the average training load for 4 practices within the time span of 6 days after sickness. And this looked like this. He averaged a trimp of 119, a movement load of 215, movement efficiency of 1.8, and an epoch peak of 75, and a heart rate recovery of 45. So what you see here, the internal values are elevated compared to the time before. Of course, it always depends on the illness, on the severity of the illness. It also always depends on the practice demands because no practice will ever be the same. But I truly believe if you consistently monitor your players and if you have a good way of organizing your data, this will help you, putting you in a better position to observe the player and to truly decide if a player is back to his old self, let's say. And the rule of thumb for me is, let's say we make something up, a player is sick for 7 days. Yeah, I think I would say these days that it takes him also 7 days of practice before his numbers look more identical to what they have looked before. Yeah, and like I said, with the fact that it depends on the illness, of course, if a player was only like under the weather for a day and would come back then most of the time there's never that much of a difference.
And what's your plan when a player has been longer sick? How are you building up the load, or is it straight to the team practice, or how are you structuring that?
Ideally, if we have time, it should always be like a build up. Ideally, if you have time, you want to build up training load slow. In professional sports, you never have enough time. Yeah. And let's say if a player was out for, I don't know, 10 days and he comes back Thursday and the game is Saturday, well, if we need him, we're probably gonna take him. Depends also on his feedback, of course. But yeah, ideally, it's always a slow build up.
Yep.
Or a consistent build up.
Yep. I want to add to this that especially when talking about return to play, if it's from sickness or if it's from an injury, HRV/recovery is critical in that sense that you need to ensure that as the training loads are getting bigger and bigger, you need to make sure that the player is coping with the bigger loads by ensuring enough recovery and measuring the heart rate variability. And I think that's something you are willing to implement next season. Is that?
Yeah, we're definitely thinking about it. We just have to find a way how we implement it, how it doesn't take too much away from what we're doing, and then obviously it needs to add something,
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. I really like this topic, comparing off-season to in-season training load. So this is always a struggle for me because before I started monitoring the off-season training loads, I was like, okay, are we doing enough? Is it too little? How does that relate to what a player is forced to do when preseason starts? That's why I was always asking myself, okay, how does our training that we do in the summer with the player relates to the regular season? To give you an example, and this is also the example I show you now in a second, when I would put a off-season training program together, and if the player is in Fechter, this is ideal, ideal world scenario. How we did it with this player, we had him do lifting sessions 4 times a week. So we do Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. And on every day from Monday to Friday, he would have a basketball individual workout with one of our assistant coaches. And in that way, he would work out 5 days a week. And the weekend would also be off because I think that's good for players because it's off season. For me, this is the dream scenario. If I would be able to achieve this with every player, I would be totally, truly happy. But unfortunately, the way I just explained it, that doesn't happen too often. Typically, the acute training load during the season ranges from 700 to 1,000. That depends, of course, always on the player because each player is different. Also different in the way how players accumulate training data. So this is the example from last year off season. So you see there the movement load and the trimp. And you can see basically a little bit like I said, that he was working for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, and then he had days off. And during the summers, something always comes up. Then he needs to go there because his family, or he needs to see friends or something. This is all okay for me. But still, I thought he got a really good amount of training in during this time period. So now let's compare this with one time frame during the season. So, and you see, it is much more, of course. Also a little, common sense, I would say, that the demands during the season, especially in the at the start of the preseason, are much higher. I'm going to give you another example. Same player. Huh? So here on the left, let's say June, July. That is off-season work. In the middle, then July, he went on holiday, and he came back at the end of July. And in August, we started with the preseason. And there you see, even though I would consider these circumstances ideal from a off-season perspective, we are still so off compared to what a player needs to go through then during the season from an internal workload perspective. And that's why I still ask myself, can we mimic in-season demands during the off-season? I don't think so. Do we even need to mimic these demands in the off-season period? I don't know. Maybe not. I don't think we need to mimic that. But if you have the chance to apply Firstbeat during the off-season, this will give you a much better understanding of overall workload. And you can then tell a player of what kind of workload he's probably has to expect when the preseason starts. But there's for sure one really important thing that I took away from this. You got to make sure that your athletes train in the summer. Because if somebody doesn't do a lot, well, then we're even further off. But with a perfect, in my eyes, in my mind, this is a perfect solution for off-season training. We're still so much off. And that for me is sometimes like, So that's why it's so important, I think, in my mind, that you make sure that your athletes train.
Yeah,
actually
absolutely.
Right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That if you think that was your ideal scenario, that the player was training with you at the Rastafeta facility,
Yeah,
and the load was that low compared to the in-season load. And if a player is not actually doing much in off-season, that how is he coping with the increased load demands then when the season starts? And
yeah,
that's rough. And if you want your players to improve season to season, and you start from zero or near to zero in August with some players, that's rough.
And it can sometimes be tough, if you sign an import player, for example, and you need to start communicating, and in the end, you cannot really control. That's why in the beginning of preseason, I was biting my fingernails because I'm like, I hope we make it through.
I guess you are not the only strength and conditioning coach who is doing that.
Yeah, I assume so too. All right, let's go. Let's keep on going. Private workouts. In our context is key, of course. In our context, players are able to access the gym in the evening if they want to shoot or something. Yeah. And since this season, I told them basically, whenever you step on the court, you gotta use it. You gotta wear it. Also, when you come in at night when nobody is there and you just get shots up, I wanna see it, because this gives us a more precise monitoring of acute training load and chronic training load. Because what happened this year is that one guy, he came in probably 5 days a week, yeah, and was shooting at night, although we had practice. And this then at some point, it adds up. Because what I saw sometimes is that, then he was also doing some tempo runs late at night. And this then in the end added, like, it was almost the game day -1 practice from the numbers, So that's why it's important, I think, to track that, because, what you want to do, we don't want to overshoot, but we also don't want to undershoot. And if a player on top of practice always does that, there's a very good chance that we are overshooting it. And that's something I think in my position is really important, that you keep track of this. That's what I just said, helps preventing excessive workload. And of course, it supports a better balance between performance and recovery, because recovery is the other side of the coin. Individual workouts. So quickly, this is, in our context, players can have an individual workout with our assistant coaches, for example, just before practice. And since I record everything, at some point during daily exposure over and over and over again, what happens, you get a little bit of an idea what is a lot, what is maybe not that much, also from a mechanical perspective. And now I'm able to say, I always tell our assistant coaches that we maybe should not exceed a movement load of 120, at least in our context. Maybe for you, this is completely different. Last week's webinar with Henry Barrera, I really liked it. He also was talking of average trim scores for their setting, much higher than our setting. Doesn't mean that it's wrong. If they're used to it, fine. Yeah. With us, it's a little lower. So that's why context always matters. What you asked earlier, if you have a good understanding of individual practices, and you have a guy who's coming back from sickness, yeah, ideally, if we can bring him back at the start of the week, the guy who was sick, we would, like 1 or 2 days before, we would like to slowly start building him up. And that's where you can put these reference values into good use, because maybe we start with him like a movement load for 30 minutes of max 120, and then he takes a shower, next day he goes a little more, and then we can slowly build up the training load again. So that's where these reference values also fit in quite nicely. And of course, what I said before, it gives us a better monitoring of acute training load and chronic training load. Do you have any questions so far? Because this is here the surprise content we haven't even talked about up front.
We do, but I think let's leave the questions at the end. We have still some time, so we are good to go with this first and take all of the questions at once.
Okay, perfect. I love this topic. Let's see. So physiological player profiles. It's basically, I'll give you an example. We have 3 profiles. Profile number 1. Again, this has all emerged through me using Firstbeat on a regular basis. Profile 1, what I see a lot of times. Yeah, we have a player that continuously shows high trim, that maybe shows lower movement load. Yeah, not maybe, he shows lower movement load. And this, of course, goes with low movement efficiency. He always reaches high epoch peak values.
Could you please explain movement efficiency? That maybe not that clear for everybody.
yeah, movement efficiency it's so simple for me. It's just movement load divided by trim. I'm not sure if it's very scientific, but it gives me a good idea, and I can tell you that movement efficiencies for me above 1.8, like 2.5, 2.6, 3.0. So a movement efficiency of 2 would be a movement load of 200 and a trim of 100.
Yes.
Yeah.
So external load
So
divided by internal load.
yes, exactly. And then we have epoch peak values are high. The time spent in high intensity training above 90% of the heart rate max is high, and he has low heart rate recovery. In numbers, this could look something like this. So he has a trim of 110, movement of 150, 51. The movement efficiency equals 1.37, epoch peak of 91, almost 6 minutes up, and heart rate recovery of only 32. To what
And
I see,
that's in
yeah,
30 seconds, I assume.
exactly the highest within 30 seconds. The amounts of beeps
Yes.
per beep. Yeah. And this is what I see a lot, especially in the beginning of the season. Yeah, that the trim scores are much higher, or like, let's say not much higher, higher in general. Movement load a little lower, movement efficiency low. This would be the first profile, and I can fit quite a few athletes in that profile. Let me give you a second profile. So with these guys, it's almost identical. So high trim, lower movement load, low movement efficiency, high epoch peak, quite a lot of time spent in high intensity training. But here comes the difference: a high heart rate recovery. That changes everything for me. So look at this. So he maybe has a trim of 136, 197 movement load, 1.45 movement efficiency, epoch peak, and almost 7 minutes up. But he has a heart rate recovery of 69. That for me changes everything, because if you don't know the heart rate recovery, yeah, then you would probably put that player in the same bucket as profile one. But the fact that he has a high heart rate recovery is important to me, because that tells me, okay, something must be working right, because he can recover quick. And maybe the way he accumulates the data, maybe that's just the way he is physiologically. Maybe this is just his physiological signature. And this is also a great piece of info that I can share with the head coach. Because I can tell you that, this guy I'm speaking of, if you look at him, you would be like, oh, okay, he is huffing and puffing a lot. But what you can also see, if there's a short break in practice, he's ready again. So this is a very interesting profile, but it's also a profile that I do not see that often. Maybe 2 times so far, but it's still out there. So that means everything is still, you always need to be careful with judging, because you sometimes can see things that you do not expect.
Yes. So what you are saying, the player is accumulating moderate movement load, but then high internal load. So his internal engine is running on a high RPM, but he's recovering fast when there's the opportunity.
Yeah, I think so. That would be my explanation.
Yeah.
And I have like monitored that player now for 3 years. And I was also thinking, okay, maybe his heart rate max is just wrong. Maybe
that was my next question. The trick question. Have you done your homework?
Yes, of course. I know you have done it. Yeah, I mean, I'm still observing that, but no, it's correct. It's correct.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
That's why you never know. Maybe some things are just the way how they are.
Yep. Each of us are individuals, and some accumulate internal load on a faster rate, have different heart rate kinematics than others, and this is definitely a player profile that we also see.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. Then let me finish with the third profile. And if I had to choose, of course, this is how I would love to see all my athletes, and you probably already imagining what's coming. So then you have the guys who show low trim, immense movement load, because they just simply move a lot. Of course, then you have high movement efficiency, you have low epoch peak scores, you have very little time spent above 90% of the heart rate max, and of course you have high heart rate recovery. So this would then typically look like like, or could look like this. So a trim of 102, a movement load of 270, higher movement efficiency, epoch peak of 37, 0 minutes above 90%, and a relatively high heart rate recovery. So this is, like I said before, this is the ideal profile that I would love to, be embodied by all the athletes, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess this is maybe something that you see, that there's a shift from the first profile to the third profile, hopefully during the season.
Yes, for sure. Especially, like I said, especially in the beginning, start of preseason, trim scores are always higher. And then you see some guys just taking off, in a good way. I mean, so basically, you can say that these players, they simply get more efficient. So the price tag of basketball in terms of the internal load gets smaller and smaller. So everything that they are required to do from a mechanical standpoint on the court, like I said, gets smaller. So that's why also the efficiency is higher. They're adapting to the demands of basketball, and that's what you want to see. And I think that's also a great feedback that you can share with the players, but also with the head coaches if you needed to. And they are simply able to recover relatively, or no, not much quicker, like when you have breaks between these intense bouts of exercise.
Yep.
So these are the three profiles that I see, and they are, knowing these profiles also, has advantages. So I use historical data. Like I have my own historical data sheet. I use your stuff because you have been developing lately in the way you present data enormously. I really like that. So that's what I also using. I also have my own. But if you then can combine the insights of the physiological profiles and the historical data analysis, this then helps me identify irregularities or maybe even red flags much quicker. Yeah. So I rather see these profiles when I look at my iPad instead of the historical data. I see the profiles first, and if I see if something is off, okay, then I can check my historical data sheet, and then I could really go into the detail, and that helps me being more responsive. Of course, it lets me cross-reference my sheet and the stuff that I see during live monitoring. And what I also do in order to make better decisions during practice is the fact that at some point, it might sound a little strange, but at some point, your athletes in numbers. I always joke with that with my guys, because sometimes, if I download the data after practice, I'm sometimes standing in front of the changing room because all the sensors are in there, and then I'm standing there, and some players sometimes get out, and then they're like, "Oh, Dom, you're downloading your data again?" Yeah, I'm downloading my data again. So it's sometimes a little weird, but that's what you do. If that helps us improving our risk management, that's what I'm doing. But what I wanted to say is, if you look at your practice during live monitoring, and you know that one player in trim is typically much below the average, yeah, and then all of a sudden, maybe at the start or during the half of the practice, he is much higher than what the average says, then something is different, and that's where you can then really start, initiate conversations with the player. Is everything all right? Okay, do I have all good? And then sometimes you get pieces from the player that you might use and improve your decision making. It improves early identification of deviations, like what I just said. It basically improves your decision making. As a conclusion,
I have to come back to the last slide. You have the picture on the right, which is a bit funny. What's the story behind that?
Professional sport is sometimes not as professional. And sometimes I'm a little bit, but that's okay. Some guys, they always put the sensor on top of the jerseys, especially in the beginning, because it's cold on the skin.
Oh yeah,
so
I see.
That's why I'm sometimes like, hey, sensor, yeah. But that happens, and I'm willing to say that every day. That's fine. Absolutely fine.
and happens still.
Yeah, it happens still. Yeah,
Okay,
maybe
yeah,
it's also a joke for them. Maybe they
yeah.
want to see if
I
I'm
hope
up.
so. I hope so.
But these days I figured the guys out. Uh, Let me get to my conclusion. So I love this quote: "Sports science is science in the wild." It's from Dan Taylor, and Dan Taylor. I heard this in a podcast. He's a director of applied sports science with the Charlotte Hornets, and I think professional sports will never be clinical practice because the environment is simply not conducive to that. And we always have to remember that we as human beings, we are incredibly complex and adaptive systems. So knowing all the data from Firstbeat is obviously a good thing, but still, whatever we monitor, if we would even couple it with with the different system, this it will never put us in full control. So, but that is not bad. I always like to call Firstbeat. Let's say you're in a dark room and you don't see anything and you don't know where to go. For me, then Firstbeat is that candle that you know that gives you direction, tells you where to go, sharpens the blurred lines a little bit better. Um, and that's what I'm trying to say here. It just gives us more navigation for effectively and in the end, ultimately, and that's what we are, in my mind, are doing. We're trying to improve risk management. One of my best friends, Stefan Dahl, used to work with me in Bamberg. He said that once to me, and it still resonates with me because I think this is what we're doing. We're trying to manage risk, and we're trying to improve that as best as possible. And that's where a monitoring system like Firstbeat comes in, because it simply gives us another layer of looking at things and maybe detecting things earlier, sooner.
I would say Firstbeat is more like a LED lamp with 1,000 watts in the room, but that's just my opinion.
Of course, good that you're not biased.
A bit,
No,
a bit.
I mean, of course, I would say the same in your position. Of course,
Yes,
don't get me wrong. I mean, you know what I meant with that.
yes, yes, absolutely.
It's great tool to have.
Yes, yes. Okay, perfect. Questions. The first one we had already in the beginning. So the second one is a higher movement load means the athlete is working at a higher intensity.
Not necessarily.
Yes. So movement load is the sum of X, Y, and Z accelerations. And if the athlete is working on a higher intensity, also the accumulation of movement load is on a higher rate. But also high movement load could just mean that the player has been moving on a slow rate for a long time.
Exactly. Exactly. And again, here it's very important to mention you need you need to know your athletes. You need to know how each of you guys accumulates movement load. And
Yeah,
that's what I think in my mind, that's what you need to compare to one another instead of comparing player A with player B. First of all, compare player A with player A.
yeah, exactly. As all of us are working or moving on an individual way, movement load is also accumulating on an individual rate. Okay, the next question is, in which way do you check for peak heart rate in the preseason, or what kind of assessment you are doing / testing?
Oh, great question. This year we did the 30-15 IFT, the intermittent fitness test, and my hope was to get true peak heart rates from everybody, and I was disappointed because some guys, they stopped before they basically were at their capacity. So, but for some guys it worked, but for a lot of guys it also didn't work. So what I do, it's a great question, very important question. What I'll do, I always check at the end of each week from the preseason. There's this data report you can draw from Firstbeat, and I there check the peak heart rates. And then, if there is, I don't know, if there is 190, 191, 192, 189, and one with 205, I wouldn't take that. Because for me, this would be an outlier then.
And there's also the automatic outlier detection or error detection that the Firstbeat is not updating the max heart rate automatically if the data quality is not good enough.
Perfect. Yeah, that's how I do it. And then, of course, but this would be a complete different topic. I during the preseason, they need to wear it during games. And this is a complete different topic. This is where they really get up.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Next question. If you would mimic in-season demands during the off-season, you probably wouldn't be able to overload Satan aspects, or would you run them into ground? What are your thoughts?
It depends, if this was really your goal and if you build it up nicely, you can do that. But it's going to be tough, I think. Then the players have to come in twice per day. I mean, that's something they do during the season too. But you could, I think you could just, it's just a matter of question what the player wants. If he really wants to work and if you have the personnel who can do that with him during the summer, because most of the time we have a little bit more time during the summer because of being off and stuff. But yeah, you could, but it would also be very demanding from a coaching perspective.
Yeah, yeah. And mostly in off season, you want to develop also other performance metrics than just endurance, for example, or load the athletes. So that's also good to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Okay, then the last question. We are already on 1 hour. Is heart rate recovery like heart rate variability, very individualized? For example, one athlete can have heart rate variability regularly. Okay, this is heart rate recovery regularly over 80, while another athlete has heart rate recovery 40 when well recovered. So I can take this one.
Mm-hmm.
So heart rate recovery is not that individualized as heart rate variability, and heart rate recovery correlates nicely with the endurance performance of the athlete. So as the endurance performance, as the aerobic endurance is improving for the athlete, also heart rate recovery values are improving. So it's also a nice marker of the endurance condition of the athlete and recovery state. Good.
Good. Then
we
I
are
move
1
on.
minute over time. Let's move on with the slides.
Yeah. So I've written some blog posts if you're interested. Just Google them. I also have another webinar. This is my second webinar. I mean, happy. And yeah, if you have any questions, like I said in the beginning, I don't have any magic formulas. For me, it's trial and error. If you can reach out to me via my email, or if you can also use Instagram. Completely up to you. Thanks for having me again, and it was my pleasure.
Thanks, Tom. Really, really, really nice that you were presenting these insights, these little secrets today.
There's little secrets, yeah.
Okay, then very shortly we have a weekly training session, a weekly training planning based on physiological data session on next week, Tuesday, the 17th of June at 2 p.m. Central European time. Feel free to attend. It's completely free. I will be hosting that one. And please, Tom, move on to the next slide. I would like to thank you all. And if you have any questions, please get in contact. We will answer the remaining questions via email and send the recording to you in the next days. Thanks a lot, Tom. Thanks, everybody, and see you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.